Hello, welcome to week 3 in our course, The Theology and Ethics of Bonhoeffer. For this week, we have an optional video that you will find the link to YouTube, and it is an interview to Eric Metaxas, who is the author of a biography of Bonhoeffer, precisely called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, and Spy. Now, I find the book interesting because it reads like a novel. However, his approach, some assumptions that he makes about Bonhoeffer, I feel that they are too much tainted by Metaxas' own evangelical background and agenda. Now, there is nothing bad about that. But just a caveat, as either if you read his biography of Bonhoeffer and now watching these interviews, these videos where Metaxas explain a little bit the content and the background for his book and his interest in Bonhoeffer. So bear in mind that some of his understandings about what Bonhoeffer was all about and the importance, implications of Bonhoeffer for us today is very much filtered by this evangelical, almost born again type of lens. As I said, nothing wrong with that, but just bear that in mind. There's another biography, by the way, which is the classic, and the author is Herbert Bethge, who was, as you may recall, was a student of Bonhoeffer and a very close personal friend. So that is, let's say, the classical biographical work on Bonhoeffer, but it is very much loaded in a very, German academic style, uh, with details that is very different from this American style to the general public, which is the characteristic of Metaxas' biography. Anyway, let's go now to the material for this week. So we're changing the pace, we're changing the type of material that we are considering, because for this week 3, we have some essays or articles of Bonhoeffer around pastoral care and the office, right, of the minister, of the pastor, as well as sermons. So let me tell you a little bit, what to look at as you read the first section, the section on Seelsorge, that is, what we call pastoral care in our categories nowadays. We will see that he envisions that probably in a very Lutheran way as integral to the office of preaching. So pay attention to that, and I would be interested to read in your responses how these measure up. I mean, his understanding and his theological approach to the office of preaching, pastoral care, etc. How this compares, we could say, with the type of approaches or assumptions that we have today in our churches, in our seminary even, about what is pastoral care all about. You would notice that for him, what is central is the preaching, no, office, and as I said, pastoral care is understood within it. Now, there's another thing that I would like to hear from you, if possible. I mean, if this rings a bell, which is his distinction between care and direction, or you can say spiritual care and spiritual direction. And the language, the category of spiritual direction or having a spiritual director seems to be in vogue nowadays in our context. Um, so, well, you will see Bonhoeffer has an issue with that, right? Um, so anyway, I'm not going to say anything more rather than to point out that aspect and see, what your take on this is. So let's move into the sermons. These sermons spans from the year 1935 to practically 1939, in the verge of the outbreak of the Second World War. So again, always um, have the larger context in mind. If there's information that you're missing, you can, online, you can check out, what was going on in Germany at that time. I think it's important for you to have this always as a background, no? To understand better what Bonhoeffer is trying to address and what was the spiritual, mental, psychological condition, besides the social, political, and cultural condition that German people or the congregations where Bonhoeffer was preaching were going through. Um, so we have sermons with a variety of themes, and one thing that I will recommend to you that in the edition that we're reading, that they don't have necessarily the whole biblical text. So, but there is a reference to the text that inspired Bonhoeffer and what he was preaching about. So, take a time and read the biblical text, right, before jumping into the sermon. Even it will be a little bit like a devotional moment for you. So, as I said, we have different themes in these sermons, and I am very interested to retain the topic of the first sermon, the issue of the living God, because here he points out that this experience that became more intense, we could say, during the secular age, after the Enlightenment, that is, and that continues today, this feeling, this experience of God's remoteness, no, this God that seems to have abandoned us, that seems to be no longer close to us, and how Bonhoeffer tries to understand this also from a Christological point of view, and even from the point of view of the theology of the cross, which for him indicates that God conceals, right, the divine self in this world. This is a Christological template, we could say, for him to approach this experience of God's remoteness and we could say even hiddenness. Then he will talk also in another sermon about forgiveness. Please bear in mind the radical nature of this preaching, right? During a time of tremendous dissension and political, cultural, and social conflict. So he will address this issue of forgiving without end. Another sermon has to do with the topic of learning to die, which is, by the way, is a very, I would say, very political sermon as well. He asks about how do Christians learn to die. He speaks about God's judgment, but also brings up this notion or this issue of Babylon, right? And speaking about the power of Babylon and so on. So for us, the question is, what would be our Babylon in our contemporary scenario? We will also find sermons for funerals. In this case, is a grandmother. Also, sermons addressed to his confirmants. Also, wedding occasions. And then he moves also into, again, the issue of vengeance, dealing with the reality of the enemy. Another one on Christ's love and our enemy. And here I, I invite you to read it in a twofold way. You know, these sermons sometimes, or I should say, the context where these sermons were delivered were very delicate in the sense of, you know, he could have been accused of preaching against the authority, against the government, and so on. So much of it is rather coded. Mm. Probably the audience, his contemporary audience, understood perfectly well what he was referring to, but he can use this, you know, hyperbole and uses some images and symbols of a biblical provenance to address aspects, dimensions that were going on in his German society, you know, during his day. So going back to this sermon on Christian love and our enemies, as I said, there's two ways to approach it, and this is just, you know, a theory, just test it. One would be, you know, to understand plainly enemies as, you know, those who either hate us or that we hate, and right, and people that we have conflict with, and so on, which, you know, by that time, considering Bonhoeffer and his seminarians, etc., it was clear that the Nazis presented this type of problem, right? The adversary, the enemy. But what if, another possibility, Bonhoeffer is speaking about the enemy in a more, I would say, cryptic way, that is to say, he's referring to what German society considered at that time as the enemy, right? For example, we saw already the socialists, the communists, and so on, and the Jews. Now, try it. Try this reading, you know, as we attempt, you know, to dig a little bit deeper into what Bonhoeffer, what type of message Bonhoeffer was trying to convey. So we're dealing mostly with sermons. So the language that you will find here will be slightly, obviously, different from the more academic work that we will visit throughout this semester. So this was I thought it was a good chance to have a taste of how Bonhoeffer translates his solid and elaborate theological ideas, right, to a public, to an audience that you know, are more familiar with more you know, biblical categories. What we can say in a situation where Paul Ricoeur would call a first naivete, that is when there is a continuity between our experience of faith and the primal biblical symbols. Now, as we deal with sermons, with the preached word, with the proclaimed word, remember that doctrines, and I think that this is what Bonhoeffer does very well, doctrines are never in the forefront of a sermon, of a homily, right? Doctrines function like these background type of rules, like grammatical rules, structuring the way how we interpret scriptures, and at the same time, we interpret and we attempt to address the contextual situation. So you will not find a lot of, we could say, doctrinal or dogmatic jargon in these sermons, but on the contrary, a living voice addressing the situations, existential, social, and also church spiritual situations that his congregations, or the congregations that he was addressing, were going through. So enjoy the readings, and I'm looking forward to read your posts.